So we mentioned Steve on Wednesday night. I'll give you updates on his daughter as we go through this. We do need to pray for him. He was looking forward to it. I was looking forward to it, hearing somebody else teach on it. We'll go through this together. If you know anything about what I do, I always have way more material than we need. So I try to jump on the horse pretty quick and get rolling, because most of the time folks say, if you've got something to share, and it's valuable, go ahead and take the time to do it. It would be nice if somebody, John the Revelator, Peter, somebody who wrote on end times, it would have been great if they had have taken what was in some of the other books and brought it all together and consolidated it and said, this is the timeline, this is what's going to happen first, this is what's going to happen next, this is what's going to happen suddenly, this is what you're going to have time to get ready for, this is who's going to be the Antichrist, this is the nation that he or she's going to come from, whatever. If somebody had done all that, nobody did all that. If we have time, which we probably won't, but if we have time, we'll talk about some of the reasons that they didn't do that. But a part of it had to do with the Roman Empire, and whatever they shared among the churches, they didn't necessarily want the Roman Empire to understand and know all of it. So part of it was code that they would have understood. Part of it reflected on ancient Jewish history that they would have known, that nobody else would have known, and they wouldn't have understood that. Anyway, but we don't have that, so we just have to piece together a lot of things, and those lots of things come from a lot of different books in the Bible. So if you were thinking about end-time materials in the Bible, which books of the Bible would come to your mind? Daniel.
Isaiah.
Who? Isaiah. Ezekiel. Revelation. Anything else that just jumps out? Like big passages? Matthew. That's one of my favorite passages for a lot of reasons, and that's where we're going to start tonight. So if you've got a Bible with you, we're going to look at a few verses from Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23 is the largest block of teaching that Jesus gave on end-time events. It was in the last week of his life. He did a lot of things in the last week of his life. And it is the next largest block of end-time material in the New Testament compared to the book of Revelation. So we're going to focus on chapters 24 and 25, but we'll start off in Matthew chapter 23. And we'll spend a bit of time tonight looking at this map and just, I don't know, it's not a map, chart, whatever word you would call it, and just because we'll be using it all the way through. I hope to put together some session notes for each week. I've got session notes from having done this for 35 years, but it doesn't change, but the focus and what's really going on in the world and all that kind of drives the topics that we talk about. But hopefully we'll get to a point tonight where I just ask you, what do you want to talk about? What are some questions you have? So be thinking about that as we go through. Matthew 23 is where we'll start, in verse 37. So we shouldn't put people in groups, but for just a minute, help me put people in groups. Here in the U.S., here in Alabama, you got this group of folks and this group of folks. Go. Auburn, Alabama. Republicans, Democrats.
Color of skin.
Color of skin, but mostly you've got this and you've got this. You've got the haves and the have-nots. You've got introverts and extroverts. So we could put out a lot of topics, and all of those, they're either about football, they're either about finances, they're about politics, they're about something. in relation to the end times, we're going to be looking at three groups of people all the way through this study. And they're on this chart here in front of you. All the way over at the far left, you've got the church, the Jews, and basically everybody else. So the church would be, well, we'll start with the Jews. So how would we identify someone who is Jewish in our world today? And I don't mean, they got those, hair and that hat. Well, what would we say to identify, to describe Jews today, who they are, where they are, that kind of thing?
They're still waiting on the Messiah.
Say that again?
They're still waiting on the Messiah.
Still waiting on the Messiah.
They go to temple. They go to temple.
They go to temples or synagogues, or they go to their service is different from ours.
Their name.
Ma'am?
Their name.
Their name?
Tell you that they're Jewish.
Is it a large group?
No.
Less than like 1/5 of 1% of the world's population, 8 billion people. So about a fifth of a percent are Jewish. Probably about 16 million people. About half of them live in the United States. About half of them live in Israel, and others are spread out around the rest of the world. You've got the nation of Judah, which would have come basically from the tribe of Judah, and they're the ones that went into the Babylonian captivity, and they returned home. You've got all the other tribes that were taken captive 150 years before that by the Assyrians, and they never came home. So the 16 million Jews that we know are the Jews that know that they're Jews. But there are a lot of Jews all over the world that don't even know they're Jews, that they're descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, because their history was hidden from them, erased from them, not passed on from generation to generation 150 years before what happened with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian captivity. So there are Jews all over the world that don't know they're Jews. So there's more than 1/5 of 1%. We just don't know who they are right now. So that's one group of people. The second group of people is the church. How would you describe the church?
Big building.
Just do what?
I said a big building.
A big building. The body, the people, the church. What would you say to describe us?
Christ.
Followers of Christ. Saved by, through, grace through faith. Buddhist? Included in that? Muslims included in that? Not a part of the church. So, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 11% of the world's population are born again, believing in Jesus Christ, Christians.
What about the Asian?
Who?
Asian?
Yeah, that's a race of people or a nation of people. We're just talking about in terms of faith. So this.
Buddhist.
Well, we're just lumping it. We've got three categories that we're going to be dealing with the whole time, and that's Jews, the church, and everybody else. So they're in the everybody else category. So you've got the Jews who are still looking for the Messiah. You've got the church who believes that we found Messiah and we have followed Him and we have staked everything that we do on this Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And then you got everybody else, which would be the Buddhists and the Muslims and the atheists and everybody else in the world, and the Bible generally lumps them under one generic category and just calls them the nations in terms of end time events. So when you get to Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is burdened for Jerusalem. Again, this is the last week of His life. He went into Jerusalem. Luke tells us a few more details about it that Matthew did not. But in Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, Luke tells us that Jesus was weeping when He said this. He wept over Jerusalem. And He said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how many times I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you wouldn't have it." So your house is left desolate. And I say to you, you will see me no more until somebody says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And in verse 1, going on into chapter 24, then Jesus went out, departed from the temple. So he's in the temple. His disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And they're going to ask him some questions. But Jesus said to them, you see all these things, guys? You came up to show me these things. Assuredly I say to you, not one stone will be left here on another that shall not be torn down. Now, Luke added to that. Luke remembered some details, recorded some things that Matthew did not. Luke talks about a day when their enemies would barricade them, when they would be surrounded and hemmed in on every side, when their city would be leveled to the ground. To the women specifically, he said, they will slaughter you and the children within you. And Luke records this, not one stone will be left on another. So this event that Jesus is talking about, we're going to talk about what he's talking about, but just get the picture. They've been in the temple. We would assume it, is maybe late in the day, and they're leaving the temple. And as they leave, they leave the temple. There's an entrance on the eastern side of the temple that points right to the eastern gate of Jerusalem, and the eastern gate of Jerusalem leads right on out. Just probably less than a mile, you begin the ascent of the Mount of Olives. I hadn't been there, hope to go there someday. And the Mount of Olives is not like Mount Everest now. At most, it would be like Stone Mountain over in Georgia. There's one side of it that you can climb up at Stone Mountain. So you can make your way up, and you can stand there just a couple of miles from the city, and you get this beautiful panoramic view of Jerusalem. So they've left, gone out the eastern temple door. They've gone out the eastern gate. They've headed up the Mount of Olives, and the disciples stop Jesus and say, "Look, look, 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 look." And so they're looking back over their shoulder. If it were early morning, the sun would have been shining on the temple, and it would have been dazzling and beautiful because of all the gold. It must have been late afternoon, and so the sun setting on the opposite side, the western side of Jerusalem, and they get this silhouette of the city or something, but something got the disciples' attention, and they said, "Look." And Jesus, the ultimate buzzkill at times, said, "Just want to let you know something, not going to be here in about 40 years. And that's exactly what happened. So there were times when the Roman Empire protected Christians, and there were times when the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. And so about 33 years after Jesus died, the Roman Emperor Nero executed Paul, and about 38 years after Jesus died, the Roman Emperor Titus had the city destroyed, and the second temple was destroyed. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. That's what he's saying is going to happen. That conversation, what Jesus said, brought some questions to the disciples' mind. And so they asked him a question in verse 3. They made it on up to the top of the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" He didn't answer that question. But they also asked him, "What will be the sign of your coming? How will we know it's the end of the age?" And that's a question that we've all asked. I've done several studies here in the 12, 13 years that I've been here at Casada. This is the largest group that we've had on opening night to start with. By the end, there'll be 8 of us in here. No, it's... is that me? Okay, I'm just making sure, because that sounds just like mine. I was making sure I didn't need to check it. So it's the same kind of question that we're asking. We hunger for this information. When somebody says we're going to talk about it, I'm signing up for that class. I'm going to be there. I'm going to see what it's like. So the disciples said, what should we be looking for to let us know that the day of the Lord that we've been talking about since Isaiah is beginning to happen? What should we be looking for? So we're going to look, and what I hope we'll do next week, I better get my clock. I hope next week we'll look at Matthew 24 and 25. Just look through just those chapters and try to get just a big picture of what we see. But I want to ask you to read that. If you plan to be back next week, read Matthew 24 and 25. That's it, just 2 chapters. They're a little bit long. They're a little bit deep. But if you know what you're looking for, they make a whole lot more sense. So I want to tell you something to be looking for. Again, this is Rodney's understanding. This is Rodney's interpretation. I'm not a scholar. I'm a Bible reader, and I read a lot of commentaries. So I've read what a lot of other people say, and this is an understanding. This is an understanding that makes a lot of sense to me. So be looking for this as you read Matthew 24 and 25. The disciples asked one question. How many possible answers could there be? Why do I say 3?
Jews, believers, and others.
Because there's 3 different groups of people that are going to be involved in the end time events, and what they should be looking for that lets them know that the timer is winding down for them is very different for all 3 groups. So one question, and Jesus really gives 3 answers here. So be looking for these as you go through this. So if Jesus is going to answer this question, and they say, and they ask him, what should we be looking for? You've got the Jews, you've got the church, you've got everybody else, the nations. Who do you think that Jesus would answer that question for first? The Jews. That's His chosen people. Jesus was a Jew. He's talking to Jews. He answers the question for Jews. If you're a Jew, this is what you should expect. So I'll have a handout for you next week that has them broken down. I've got it written down. I could tell you now, but you'd have to write it down quickly. And honestly, I don't even see that on the notes that I've got in front of me. But the first section, beginning in verse 4, where the words go red, is Jesus talking. And Jesus just talks, Matthew 24 and 25. And His first answer is to the Jews. So here's a sound bite of that, beginning in verse 15. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. Jesus says, when you Jews, you specifically, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, who talked about the abomination of desolation? Daniel the prophet. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So that's basically his first answer. So we're going to read a little bit more of that. So we've identified the group that Jesus is talking to as the Jews. So the language that He uses when He talks to the Jews is dealing with Old Testament prophecy about things that involve the temple, about things that involve the abomination of desolation. Now, one neat thing, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let me just keep moving for right now. In the book of Daniel, Daniel talks about 70 weeks of years. What is a week of years? 7 years. It's not a week of days, it's a week of years. So it's 7 years. Daniel talks about 70 weeks of years. So that'd be 490 years. And Daniel talks about the first 69 weeks. And Daniel says there's a last week. And if we read Daniel and we read the Old Testament and the New Testament, we'll come to the conclusion that last week that Daniel talks about has not happened yet. So Daniel talks about this 7-year period, this 70th week of years, this 70th 7-year period that has not happened yet. We call that the tribulation. That's why we say that the tribulation is going to last for 7 years. So the tribulation itself is broken into 2 halves, the first half and the second half. During the first half, life for the Jews is going to be pretty good or pretty bad? Pretty good. during the first half, based on what we understand, Daniel tells us, this is what Daniel tells us. Daniel tells us that during the first week of the tribulation, this figure that we call Antichrist is going to make a coalition among the nations. So he's probably going to be some kind of European leader, maybe Russian, maybe Asian, maybe Middle Eastern, but somebody from probably over on the other side of the pond. Probably going to be somebody, but this leader, whoever he is, this Antichrist, he's going to form this coalition, going to be a powerful political leader, and he's going to protect the Jews. So for the first half of the tribulation, life for the Jews is going to be pretty much okay. So for the last 2,000 years, the Jews have been spread out all over the world. What happened in 1943, 1945 in that ballpark time frame? World War. What happened 2 or 3 years later in May of 1948? Some nation, some group became a nation that had not been a nation in years. So Harry Truman signs off on this, says, I agree, we're going to recognize the state of Israel. So in 1948, just within our life, within the lifetime for many of us, we may be old enough to actually, as a child, remember when this happened. So this happened. So 1948, Israel became a nation, and at that point, Jews began to go home. Home. That was home for them. Now, there's been all kind of fighting since then, and there's all kind of stuff going on right now that we have questions and we're trying to understand, and we'll talk about a little bit of that tonight, and we'll talk about more of that later on. But in 1987, about 40 years later, something originated in Israel among the Jews called the Temple Movement. And what exists now today is the Temple Institution. And if you Google the Temple Institution, you will find that they have already built, they have some things that they might say are original, but they certainly have all the patterns and templates, and they have many of the furnishings for the third temple already constructed, and they're ready. Whenever that moment happens and they're able to build that temple on the place where that temple is supposed to be, they've already got a lot of the stuff that goes in it. So what stands in the way of the Jews building the temple right now? Big Muslim shrine called the Dome of the Rock that sits on the Temple Mount. And that's one of the reasons there's so much fighting that goes on around there. And if you go on a trip to the Holy Land and you go to the Temple Mount, you better keep your head down. You know, you just never know when somebody might throw a Molotov cocktail or something, or just whatever. You know, whatever. And it's been that way since 1948. And now they're not lobbing Molotov cocktails, they're lobbing missiles over in there. So the Jews are ready. They've got this stuff ready, but something stands in the way, and something political will have to happen in order for the Jews to construct the third temple. If we read the Bible, if we read Daniel, the political thing that's probably going to happen is this Antichrist is going to emerge, form this coalition, one world government, one world order, one world currency. We see a lot of this in the book of Revelation, and the Jews are going to be protected, and the ones here in America, if they have not been knocked out by a nuclear bomb or whatever it is that leads us into the tribulation, we'll talk about that along the way, maybe tonight again, you know, depending on where and when we run out of time. Whoever's left, the Jews are going to go back to the Holy Land, and they're going to start doing some things on their terms and on their turf, and this world government led by Antichrist is going to back it up. And anybody who pushes back against that will be dealt with without a whole lot of patience, and, you know, don't ask questions, just go along. So the first section that first group that Jesus addresses is the Jews, and Jesus says, when the Jews see, not you guys who are living here, because he didn't specifically say you won't be here, but when the Jews see the abomination of desolation occur, get ready. So the Jews need not be looking for the rapture. They're not going. The Jews need not be worried that much about the second coming of Jesus. Their fate will already be secured by then. The day that really matters for the Jews is the midpoint of the tribulation, and you better be ready when the midpoint of the tribulation occurs for the Jews, because when you see the abomination of desolation occur in this newly reconstructed temple, then times are changing and the wheel's fixing to fall off for you. And so that's what they need to be looking for. So you read on. Here's the kind of language that Jesus uses when He speaks to the Jews. If you see the abomination of desolation, you better get ready. If you are in Judea, head for the hills. This is where that came from. You better head for the hills. Let him who is on the housetop not go down and go inside to get anything. If you up there working on your roof, don't go in the house to get a pair of socks. Don't go get your shoes. Don't pack a diaper bag. Nothing. When this event happens, don't even go in the house to get anything. Get out. If you're out in the field, don't go back to your house to get clothes. Woe to those who are pregnant in those days and nursing babies in those days. And pray that the timing of all this, so that it don't work out that your flight is in winter or on the Sabbath, because there will be great tribulation. The tribulation's already been going on for 3.5 years. Jesus says the tribulation is about to become the tribulation is about to become the great tribulation, and nobody has seen anything since since the beginning of the world, and nothing like it will ever happen again. That's what Jesus says. If you're a Jew, here's what you need to be looking for. Things are going to be going pretty good for you. You're going to be up on the top of your roof, fixing your roof. You're going to be out in the field, taking care of business. You're going to have, your wives are going to be having babies and all kinds of stuff. Things are going to be pretty good for you. When you see an almost immediate shifting in the government and what's going on in the world around you and public perception of you and those kind of things, then you better find you a place to go. And so we'll talk about that. We will talk about that. May not be, I don't know when. We'll talk about where they go when they get there. One of the neat things about prophecies, but also one of the confusing things about prophecies, is that a lot of the prophecies are recurring. This abomination of desolation thing, it happened in the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament with a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, where he slaughtered a pig on the altar in the temple, and something similar to that happened with the Romans in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, and there was that kind of desolation and desecration of the temple before it was destroyed. But Jesus is clearly talking about an event that's an end-time event when he's talking about this here. Much of what Jesus said could have been applied to the Jews who were alive when the temple was destroyed. But the focus of the Jewish wrath, the focus of the Roman wrath then was not on the Jews, it was on the Christians. And this guy who spent a lot of time in the temple, and so they just kind of got sucked into they just kind of got sucked into it. And another neat thing about prophecy is that the prophets, when they were seeing these prophecies, they were basically just seeing mountain peaks. So you stand on Mount Everest, you can see another mountain that's 600 miles away. That's the farthest you can see. It had to be a really clear day, but you can see the peak of another mountain that's 600 miles away. You can't tell how far away it is. You certainly can't tell what's in between. You can't tell what's in the valleys. That's how the prophets saw. They saw the mountain peaks. They didn't even know what order these things happened in. They just saw the events. And so they wrote down the events that they saw. And so some of these prophecies that we read about have happened 2 or 3 times already. And like we said on Wednesday night a few months ago when we talked about Hamas and Hezbollah and these wars that happen, one of these times that Hamas lobs some rockets over into Israel, one of these times, it'll be the last time. It'll be the last time that happens, because what it unleashes and what happens after that will roll us into the tribulation. And we don't know when that's going to happen, and the good thing is I'm not worried about it, because I'm not in the first group. I'm not in the first group that the first half of the tribulation is going to be pretty good for me and the second half is going to be pretty bad. My understanding, and again, this is Rodney, you may not agree with this. My understanding is I'm not going to be here for any of that. Because I'm in the second group that Jesus talks to, and Jesus in the second group talks about the church. First half of the tribulation for the Jews is pretty good. Now don't misunderstand me. The tribulation is bad. Bad. First half and second half. But for the Jews, they do pretty well because the guy who's in charge is protecting them and letting them do their own thing. Second section, totally different kind of language, begins in chapter 24, verse 36. And make sure before I start reading and we're in different places. Chapter 24, verse 36. The little heading says, nobody knows the day and hour. Now, if you're going through the tribulation, and what Daniel talked about, that Antichrist is going to make a pact and he's going to protect you for 3.5 years, but the last 3.5 you better hold on because things are going to change for you. If you got a calendar, you're going to know when 3.5 years is up. It's not going to be something sudden. Now, you better be paying attention or you'll just get, we're good. We're good. Everything's fine. Don't get sucked into that. The language totally changes here. So just a few verses from beginning in verse 36. Of that day and hour, what day and hour? A different day and hour, nobody knows. Not even the angels of heaven, only my Father. It'll be just like in the days of Noah. That's how the coming of the Son of Man will be. For in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, right up until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they didn't know until the flood came and took them all away. In verse 40, he said, 2 are going to be out in the field. One's going to be taken. One's going to be left. 2 women are going to be grinding at the mill. One's going to be taken. The other's left. Jesus says, watch, because you don't know the hour when your Lord is going to come. So Jesus, to this second group, says, be ready. It is in this passage of Scripture that Jesus talks about the midnight cry with the bridegrooms. Get over in chapter 25. That's where that comes in. Jesus talks about the midnight cry. Jesus himself gave the inspiration for that song, Midnight Cry. You read Corinthians, you read Thessalonians. There are 2 passages in the latter part of the book of Corinthians and the latter part of 1 Thessalonians where Paul talks about this event that we refer to as the rapture. He says it's going to be a quick event. Like the twinkling of an eye. There'll be a trumpet. There'll be a trumpet blown. And there'll be a shout. The voice of Christ himself shouts. And Paul says that we're going to be caught up in the air to meet Jesus in the air. Don't mistake the rapture for the second coming. In the second coming, Jesus does what? He comes and he lands on earth and some things happen. In the rapture, Jesus doesn't come to earth. In the rapture, we go meet him in the air. We never leave his side again. We'll be with the Lord forever. So wherever Jesus is, from that moment forward, we're with him. And again, it's not in order. It'd have been really great if Jesus had said, here's what's going to happen first to you guys who are the church. But the church didn't even exist when Jesus is telling this. It'd have been great if Jesus had said, for some of you, you're going to be out in the field doing your own thing, and all of a sudden, boom, you're going to hear this noise and you're going to turn around and Fred ain't there anymore. You know, and he said, and then next is there's going to be this, and next there's going to be this, and so on, but we don't get that sequence. So this second set with completely different language talks about the church. To the Jews, he said, if you're out in the field, don't take time to go back to the house. Head. You by that point, you should have a place decided where you're going to go. Your tornado plan should be in place. And when it happens, you need to know where to go. To the church, he said, you're just going to be out there in the field doing your own thing, and all of a sudden one's going to be gone, one's going to be still standing there. And then there's the third group, which is everybody else, which is probably like 90%, 89% of the world. You got 1/5 of 1% that's Jewish. Probably when the Jews are identified with whatever happens that allows them to know who they are, something supernatural, the 2 witnesses, the 144,000, those things that Revelation talks about that are going to be going on in the early days of the tribulation. Probably the Jews who don't know that they're Jews will know they're Jews. It may be a full percent at that point. But you got a percent that's Jews, 10% that's the church, you got like 89% that's everybody else. And this last section deals with them. And Jesus says, here's what you need to be looking for. Jews, if you're on top of your roof and you see the sign, the abomination of desolation, you hear about it on the TV or the Jerusalem Gazette or whatever it is that you use to get your news. If you hear about it, go. To the church, he says, you're going to be going about life and you're just going to disappear one day. People are going to be looking for you and you'll be gone. To the third group, a totally different kind of language. Here's what he says in chapter 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in His glory, and all the holy angels with Him, then He will sit on the throne of His glory, and the nations of the world will be gathered before Him. So this is something that's happening here on good old planet Earth. All the nations will be gathered before Him, and He will separate them from one another just like a shepherd divides his sheep from his goats. So this is a special judgment, a specific judgment just for the nations, like 89% of the world's population that are left over at that time, which probably occurs at the end of the tribulation, right on the heels of the Battle of Armageddon. And we'll talk about this as we go through. And the criteria that will be used in this specific judgment, does anybody know what the nations will be judged for, basically, overall? Probably no, probably heard it, probably just shy and don't want to say it out. But basically, they'll be judged for how they treated Israel at some point when it really mattered. Because Jesus says you're going to see people who are naked, blind, hungry, thirsty, those 6 things that he says in this passage right here. You're going to see people, you're going to see the Jews in this situation, and what are you going to do about it? So the nations of the world basically, again, are going to be judged for how they treat the Jews, and that's totally different language from what's said to the Jews as a people. It's totally different language from what's said to the church. And so as you read, there was your introduction. As you read Matthew 24 and 25 this week, if you plan to read it, if you plan to come back, watch. He doesn't go back and forth. He doesn't talk to the Jews for a while, then talks to the church for a while, then goes back to hit the Jews some more, and then he gets to the nations. It seems, this is one interpretation. It's the interpretation that I jump on that makes sense to me. He talks to the Jews for a while. He talks to the church for a lot longer. And then there's just one really kind of short passage at the end that's for everybody else. It's not that everybody else don't matter, but by that time, there's not a whole lot left except you're here or you're here. And the sheep have one outcome and the goats have another outcome, and unfortunately for the goats, they're just cast straight into the lake of fire. Now, sometimes we think of Bible pictures as cartoons and the devil with a little pitchfork and pointy red ears. And sometimes we have a hard time of figuring out how a loving God could create a place called hell. And then ultimately hell will be emptied out, stand before God and give an account. Books are opened. Those not found in the books are cast from hell into a place that's even worse somehow, a lake of fire. And that's forever. Nobody who goes into the lake of fire, even hell is emptied at some point, but nobody who goes into the lake of fire ever comes out. We never see anybody come out of the lake of fire. So we have a hard time sometimes we start talking about this, but it's real, and we need to help folks understand that it's real, but we don't need to encourage folks to get saved so that they have a fire insurance policy. We need to encourage folks to get saved so they have a relationship with Jesus, with their Creator, with the one who, gave them an opportunity to be saved. So anyhow, as you read, listen for Jesus' answers to these questions and look for those three groups. Before we do the last little section and wrap up, anything?
Are you saying that when everybody's judged that we
Do what now?
let me see if I can put this together. Go ahead, I'll put it together. I'll ask you later.
When we look at the thing, there's something over here on the left side, up there at the top, called the judgment seat of Christ.
Yes.
And when we stand before that, there's probably not going to be a plaque up there on the wall that says the judgment seat of Christ. And for those who are judged at the judgment of the nations, there's probably not going to be a little plaque there in front of Jesus that says, this is the throne of His glory judgment. That's the language that was used right there when it was talked about, and so those just became like proper names to just distinguish these judgments. For the Christians, in great respect, our sin was judged at Calvary. But for the Christians, we will also be judged. We will stand before the Lord and we'll give an account for our works and the life that we've lived. And there'll be some well done, good and faithful servants. And there'll be some folks who were genuinely saved, but they were the folks that Brother Jim talked about in that third category this morning, that thought that the folks out there bearing fruit were like exceptional Christians and that they were normal. They were Christians, they were believers, but they just kind of lived their life on the sidelines and never really did a lot for the Lord. And at the judgment seat of Christ, somehow they're going to be, if you're saved, you're saved. But somehow the Bible indicates that there will be levels of reward in heaven, and we'll probably have a chance to talk about that somewhere along the way. So the judgment that occurs for me, I was judged at Calvary, but I will also give an account to the Lord for how I've lived my life. That thing I did, that thing I said, that mistake that I made, that willful choice, whatever, and that will occur for me at what we call the judgment seat of Christ. The nations, everybody who's left that's not a Jew at the end of the tribulation will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Jesus is going to gather the nations together. He's not going to have to work real hard at that. There's not going to be a lot left. Okay? Have you read Revelation chapter 5? By the fourth of the seals being opened, 1/2 of the world's population is already gone. So half of the world's population is wiped out by the time the fourth of 28 judgments are revealed. So there's not going to be a lot left. And they're already going to be gathered. Satan has done the work for him because Antichrist is already gathering them to Jerusalem to fight this big battle of Armageddon. And so everybody's going to be pretty much gathered there already, everybody that matters. And Jesus is going to appear. Mount of Olives is going to split. Jesus is going to hold them accountable for how they treated the Jews during particularly the second half of the tribulation. That's what we call, again, there won't be a little plaque in front of Judge Jesus that says, probably won't be, might be, probably won't be, the throne of His glory. But that's just what we call the throne of His glory. I was judged at Calvary. I'll be judged for my works when I stand before Jesus, which in my understanding will be right after the rapture. Because 7 years later, when we come back, we're on the big heels of this marriage celebration, marriage of Christ, the bridegroom, to the Lamb, and we're having the marriage supper of the Lamb that Revelation talks about. So everybody who's left, the Jews, their fate is sealed. They've already hidden themselves for the last half of the tribulation, and whoever survives will then probably stand there and watch as the nations of the world, whatever little everybody else is left, stands before Jesus to give an account for what they did regarding the Jews during the tribulation. So again, as you read Matthew 24 and 25, kind of keep that picture in your mind as you go through it. Now, as far as this chart, just real quickly, what you have, and unfortunately, if anybody listens to this recording, there's going to be times when it sounds like a helicopter's going off, because I have probably pummeled this little microphone as we've gone along. From left to right is the passing of time, and up and down would kind of represent what we think of. We somehow think of heaven as up, and we somehow think of hell as down. There are images in the Bible and pictures that we get in the Bible that give us that. Whether it is, where it is, a spiritual plane, difference of all that. That'll be another question for another study some other day. But just as you read the map, just for the purposes of understanding, if you're going up, you're going toward heaven. If you're going down, you're going toward hell. And this line right here in the middle, the yellow, the green, and the blue, is what's happening here on earth during this time frame. So over here on the far left, you see the three groups: the church and the Jews and the nations. And if you follow the yellow, it shows you where the church is during all this. If you follow the blue, it shows you where the Jews are. If you follow the green, it shows you where the Gentiles are, the everybody else, as these things unfold. So the first major event, probably, maybe, is the rapture. But there may be some things that kind of usher in the rapture. So you can look at this week and you can say, yeah, I kind of agree, that happens before that, and that happens before that, and I didn't even think about that and where that might occur, and I've read about that, and I've read Revelation. So that just kind of gives you a picture. Basically the rapture, basically the tribulation, basically the second coming in the Battle of Armageddon, basically that throne of His glory judgment where the nations are judged, basically the millennium, the 1,000 years, basically at the end of the millennium, Satan is released for one final doodah and deceives a whole bunch of people for a final war that really is over before it starts. And then at the end of that, hell is emptied. There's what Revelation calls a second revelation. We might have time to talk about the first and second revelation.
When do you think trumpet judgment is going to start?
When? After the rapture, I hope. But even Jesus said, we don't know when, just be ready. So we got to be ready. So then at that final point, hell is emptied for what the Bible refers to as the Great White Throne judgment. And we probably won't get to that throne, and there's a big plaque over that throne that says Great White Throne. But at that judgment, the books are opened, and the book of life is opened, and whoever's name is not found written in the book of life at that point is cast into the lake of fire. So that's basically a timeline. One timeline. The one that makes the most sense to me. I'm trying to teach and facilitate and get us through this. If you want to offer a class that's a totally different timeline, go talk to Brother Jim and Brother Mark, and they might give you an opportunity to teach another class. This is just one understanding of it. Even if you don't agree with every point on the timeline, most of what we're going to say over the next 13 weeks is still true, regardless of when it happens, or the order, the sequence that it happens in. But over here on the left, there's this little starburst that says Gog and Magog. And it's mentioned in the book of Revelation at the very end.
Yeah, I'm sorry about interrupting, but listening to the channels I listen to on TV, going to be two different gods and Magog.
And that's what I was fixing to say. Again, so many of these prophecies are recurring prophecies. So it seems that there's going to be a Gog and Magog over here, and Gog and Magog version 2 over here. Gog and Magog number 2 don't last very long. But Gog and Magog number 1 is really dealt with in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Again, at the end of Revelation, it's mentioned. And we'll probably spend one whole session dealing with Ezekiel 38 and 39. But this is what I wanted to leave with tonight. If we can get through this real quick. What is Gog and Magog going to look like? Gog and Magog were mentioned in the book of Genesis and Chronicles as in the genealogies, identifying them. Gog is probably a nation. Magog is the ruler, or I may have that backwards, but it doesn't matter. One is the nation, one is the ruler. There's some other references in there to Rosh, and a lot of thinking that it may be Russia, a lot of thinking that it may be China, a lot of thinking that it may be some coalition between Russia and China. It may well be one of those two. It may be somebody totally different, and we sit there and say, I didn't see that coming. But whoever it is, at the end time, there's going to be this battle of Gog and Magog. It's going to probably be one major character. It would have to be somebody in our world today. If it happened right now, it would have to be a Russia or a China. Somebody with that kind of firepower at their disposal. We're assuming that it's not going to be America. But at any rate, it's probably somebody over there. There's a lot of references that lean it in the direction of Russia. But this battle of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel says 4 things are going to characterize that battle. And we'll have a session with notes on this. It's going to be an attack on Israel. We could say, well, that just happened last summer. That happened, attack on Israel. Well, no, again, there's 4 criteria. There's going to be an attack on Israel. There's going to be a supernatural response where fire devours the enemies. There's going to be a situation where the Jews are restored to their land. Well, the Jews are basically in their land today. So it'd have to be something significant, something really sizable would change that would happen. That would be something that helps us point to an end of Revelation type event. But there's a 4th criteria that says they're going to spend 7 months burying the dead from the battle. So there's an attack on Israel, a supernatural response, Israel is restored to their land, and they're going to spend 7 months burying the dead. Now, if it was just 1 and 3, you could say, oh yeah, this is something that happened a long, long time ago. If it was just 1 and 3, you could say, well, that was World War II, that was Hitler, that was the Holocaust, that was the attack then, that was 1948, and Israel becoming a nation. If it was just 1 and 3, you could say, well, that's Hamas and Hezbollah every day of the week. So there's 4 criteria. There's a supernatural fight that God jumps in the mix. And since there's a supernatural fight, it's going to be an end time event. We're talking about something end time. So it might be could be the middle of the tribulation. Might could be a reference to the Battle of Armageddon. Might could be something that happens after the millennium. But the real kicker in this is the fact that Israel's going to spend 7 months burying their dead. The only time when that would really matter, the only time in my mind when that would really make a difference, the only time when that would really be possible would be right after the rapture. So here's what a lot of people take, and something that makes great sense to me, is that Hamas or Hezbollah or somebody is going to start lobbing rockets into Israel. And Israel is going to respond, because this is our nation and you don't mess with us. Their response might be humanitarian. Their response might be more humanitarian than it has been this time, and some of the accusations that have been made against them. Their response might include some targeting of civilians, and that might draw some criticism or whatever it is, but Israel as a sovereign nation will respond as they choose, and the world will respond to how Israel responds. And you can see today, sometimes based on political divisions in the United States, and sometimes the political parties line up in the United States on how they feel about the way Israel is responding to this current situation. But at some point, something's going to happen. Somebody's going to attack Israel. And Israel is going to respond. And as a result of Israel's response, the world is going to go to war. There's going to be something big. Russia's going to be doing something. China's going to weigh in on this. Iran's going to start lobbing missiles, and they're going to have a little bit more a little bit more power to the punch than some of the missiles that we've seen so far. And the world is going to get in on this, and it could probably be World War III that would destroy everything. But sovereignly, God will put a stop to what's going on and destroy Israel's enemies, and the world will say, we better figure out which side we're going to be on, or we're going to see what we might better be on Israel's side, or what just happened to the folks who are fighting against Israel is going to happen to us. So somewhere in our history, what happened back in October is going to happen, and the world is going to unite or fight or whatever in a way that unleashes something that would look like Armageddon, but God will put a stop to it. And somewhere in the middle of that, the rapture may occur. It may occur just before, it may occur just after, but I can see this thing snowballing like this. The missiles are lobbed into Israel. Israel responds. Enough people don't like how Israel responds, and bigger bombs start going off, and God says, "Woo! Church, come on up."
Amen.
And we're caught out. And then He stops the battle with a supernatural fire. Israel is restored to their land. They get all their stuff out of the closet. They bulldoze that Dome of the Rock, and they start some kind of construction project that doesn't have to be a golden stone mortar temple. They could begin with a tabernacle and start immediately and reinstitute the sacrificial system and break all that stuff out and start their way of life that they knew for 1,000 years before the Babylonian captivity ever occurred. And Antichrist says, "I'm going to take care of you guys. I'm going to take care of you. We're going to make a pact. I've got me a coalition of nations here, and we're going to take care of you guys." And we're out of the picture, and the church is out of the picture, and the restraining power of the Holy Spirit is taken out of the picture, and Antichrist just kind of gets to do what he wants to. God's still in control, but Antichrist gets to do a lot of what he wants to for about a 7-year period. So this Gog and Magog and the rapture are probably somehow going to be all dovetailed together through something like what we saw in October and the way the world responds to it, and it ushers in, and all that could happen in a moment. All that, there's nothing on the prophetic calendar that needs to happen before that begins. So our time is up, and it's passed up. So we'll stop, and I'll see about a third of y'all next week. No, I love this stuff. I could stay here all night, and if you're interested, be right back here. And if we grow a little bit next week, we'll be prepared to move to a little bit larger room. But thank y'all for being here, and we'll see you next week.